what has happened in Venezuela. The first time you see the American, you know, administration, the Trump administration, without putting out any sort of rhetoric about human right, about the, you know, free speech, all of this. We are looking after the oil of Venezuela. We are going to go there, and they kidnapped the president of Venezuela. He's right now in the United States facing many accusations on the part of the from the Trump administration. But when you look at the face of what is going on, what is your understanding of what has happened, and what is the backlash? What is the r- reaction from the other countries? We Yesterday we had Russia and China condemning what has happened, considering the case of Venezuela. But looking at the whole situation, at the way that the Trump administration is talking about Venezuela, what is your take?
It's very difficult to say. I'm in touch with my Venezuelan friends, as you know, and I'm sure you have your own contacts. They all have their own views. It's not There's not a single, uh, let's say, view out there that they all agree upon. I personally think that Trump, having created this armada, he has put himself in a position where he would have no option but to escalate. And escalate he did. Now, there are those who believe that there was some sort of conspiracy, and the leaders of Venezuela, they conspired to have the president removed and did some sort of deal with the United States. I find that I find that difficult to believe, because we also saw President Maduro's son give a speech to the crowd that were protesting the murderous kidnapping of President Maduro, and he was very supportive of the state and of the state institutions. And so I think it's uh, significant in itself that he was on making that statement. It was a very emotional speech. Of course, I don't understand Spanish, but I read the translation, and it was a very emotional speech. You can tell from his face that he was very emotional. But if he felt that there was a conspiracy against his family, both his parents, well, his father and his stepmother, then I think his response would have been very different. That's one thing. Um, but for middle ranking people to betray or to give information to the United States, I think that's quite plausible. In fact, with the new technology, a lot of the information that they gather doesn't even need people on the ground. And during the war with Hezbollah, or during the war against Iran, a lot of most of the information that they had was based on uh, the new technologies and their use of AI, and that helped them a lot. And that is why, for example, the policy in Iran and Hezbollah has changed with regards to how individuals and families uh, use technology. But so I personally think I personally don't believe that there was a conspiracy where the leadership of Venezuela sold out Maduro. I just don't see. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't see that. The Americans, of course, are going to continue there to put pressure on the state to get more concessions, and we'll have to see what happens. Will there be some sort of compromise, or will Trump behave in a way in which negotiations will not bear any fruit, and there will be further escalation, or the status quo will remain? That remains to be seen. But I think we should be very wary of spreading information or conspiracy theories that create division and divide among ordinary Venezuelans, or create confusion. Because if I was, God forbid, if I was on the side of the American regime and the Israeli regime and Western intelligence agencies, I would want to create fear, insecurity, and division. So I would imagine that they will be the first to promote, whether through their media or through their people close to them on the ground. They would be the first to promote some sort of conspiracy where the leaders of Venezuela, the current leaders of Venezuela, betrayed uh, President Maduro. That's one thing. Now I'm Nima. I cannot see Nima, and so I don't know if I was disconnected or you were
Yeah,
disconnected.
I see you, Professor Marandi.
Okay, so that is one thing. Where does this lead? In my opinion, I think unless the Americans are, uh, let's say, willing to be realistic and willing to compromise, I think that there will be a deadlock, because right now the state in Venezuela is united and the people are angry. And my friends in Venezuela, who are of different political persuasions, they say that President Maduro today is more popular than he has ever been before. And it's because of what happened to him, but also the way in which he conducted himself when arrested. He was very dignified. He seemed to be in good spirits, and this makes him a stronger person. So people on the streets will have expectations that of the government to be resilient against the United States. So I think it is going to be very difficult for negotiations, because the Venezuelan government will have will be seeing the people and their position on all this. And the American government, if they want to escalate, what are they going to do? I mean, they've already threatened the president-elect with murder, because they said, Trump said himself, that something far worse, or something worse, could happen to the president-elect than Maduro. The only thing worse than what has happened to President Maduro would be murder. So he basically threatened to kill her. But if he does, I don't think that's going to end well for the United States. It's only going to create greater outrage, not just in Venezuela, but across Latin America and across the world. The price that will be paid by the United States will be very high. So escalation is possible, but it's costly for the Americans. Will there be a compromise of sorts? That again remains to be seen. But at the moment, I think people keep in mind that everything is normal in Venezuela. In other words, the state institutions are all functioning. The president, the president, the vice president, and the acting president has the authority of the president until Mr. President Maduro returns. The armed forces, everything is as it was a week ago, and there's no vacuum, or there's no lack of authority. The state institutions and the Constitution are all functioning as under normal circumstances.
Yeah. One of the greatest concern on the part of people in Latin America is that when they compare what's going on in Venezuela to what has happened in the Middle East, in the West Asia, with the case of Iraq, Afghanistan, even with the case of Libya, recently Syria, they see how these sort of, actions on the part of the United States could bring chaos to the region, to the whole region. And you know how the war has influenced the security of Iran in the West Asia. How do you see that sense for the people in Brazil, for the people in other countries in Latin America who are concerned about this sort of dangerous behavior on the part of the United States?
Well, I don't think that I think there's a big difference between Latin America and our region. And that is that the United States doesn't care if there's instability in our region. Uh, the refugee flow will go to Europe, not the United States. And the United States isn't that bothered about Europe, as we see right now. especially under Trump. So, if there are sanctions against Iran and life is more difficult, people want to leave. Where do they go? They go to Europe. If Afghanistan is left without a government, where do people go? They go to Europe. The same is true in Syria. Syria is now uh, being balkanized. It's in terrible shape. Where do people go? They go towards Europe. But the United States doesn't feel the blowback is for the Europeans, not for the Americans. And it's what Israel wants. The Israeli regime wants a fragmented region. It wants a broken region so that they can reign supreme. And that, of course, was one of the foolish things that Erdogan did. And the Qataris, in particular, the others in the Persian Gulf region were assisting the dirty war in Syria, but these two countries played a central role in promoting ISIS and Al Qaeda and Al Qaeda alongside the Americans. And now they have a balkanized Syria, and they've created a balkanized Syria, and they have nothing standing between them and Erdogan doesn't have anything standing between him and the Israeli regime. So the Israeli regime would like to have the whole entire region broken into bits. But in Latin America, I think, and I'm basically this is my personal opinion. I'm not saying it's necessarily correct, but I would imagine that the Americans would be afraid of the balkanization of Latin America or the weakening of central authorities in Mexico and Colombia and elsewhere. Because if that happens, then where do the refugees go? Where do people who've lost their jobs go? Where do people who cannot sustain themselves go? They go north, they go to the United States. And that will create another crisis for the Americans, right? Right now, one of uh, Trump's key slogans has been to keep out these immigrants and refugees from the United States. But if you have a huge rise in the number of people who want to flee their countries for whatever reason, then that's going to be a big problem for the United States. So I think that probably the U.S. government is more cautious about war and dirty wars and death and destruction in Latin America than in West Asia and North Africa because they care more about their own interests and they care much less about the interests of the Europeans. But that's just
Yeah,
speculation on my part.
yeah. But we know the main goal is to do regime change in these countries. Basically, they're talking about it in Cuba, in Colombia. Venezuela is already in the process of doing that. How was the experience in Iraq, in Afghanistan after 20
Well,
years?
yeah, I agree with you. I mean, let's say there is regime change in Cuba. Will the supporters of the current government in Cuba uh, accept regime change? I don't think so. Will the supporters of the President Maduro in Venezuela accept? Will they accept the U.S. regime change in Colombia or Mexico? I don't think so. I think what will happen is that there will be civil war or there will be an insurgency against the U.S. appointed regime, and that is going to lead to a crisis across Latin America. I mean, we have to keep in mind that the huge number of refugees that travel to the United States, that have been going to the United States over the last few decades, they're mostly from Latin America. And it's partially, I mean, to a large degree, as a result of years of U.S. Uh, support for authoritarian regimes that have been very violent against its own people and against the left, the political left, and ultimately a military left. And so when countries are torn apart due to US foreign policy, people move. And that's one major reason why people have been leaving Latin America for the United States over all these decades. So to intensify that at this time with regime change wars, I think it would make it much worse than before. The crisis in the refugee crisis. But the United States isn't a very rational actor either, and Trump is a person who is changes his position. He flip flops all the time, and he's not a reasonable person. One day he says one thing, the next day he says something completely different. He may and the U.S. political regime, they're constantly making irrational decisions. So based on my understanding, if they take a rational position, they would not move for regime change. But then again, it's the United States. All these wars, we knew from the beginning when they invaded Iraq that it would end this way. I think we all knew this. Same thing, by the way, in Iraq. They were saying that it will be easy and that the oil will pay for the occupation. We won't, but ultimately they spent trillions of dollars, not hundreds of billions of dollars, not $1 trillion. They spent trillions of dollars in Iraq. So, and it is one reason why we had the the economic crisis in 2008 and 2009. I mean, neoliberal policies and all that played a big role, but the trillions of dollars being wasted in Afghanistan and in Iraq contributed to the crisis significantly. So if one looks at Iraq, which is a very wealthy country when it comes to oil, the United States lost big time, and the parallels in Venezuela are quite striking. Trump has been saying the same thing. Everything will pay for itself. We will make money from the oil, but and there are some people who've actually been saying over the past few days, good friends, very very excellent analysts, better than me, who've been saying that what Trump wants to do in Venezuela is to take the oil, West Asia, meaning with Iran, that they will be able to use that oil to keep oil prices down. But I find that very difficult to accept. Maybe but first of all, Venezuela exports very little oil, relatively speaking. If there's oil, let's say war in the Persian Gulf region, all the oil from West Asia and the Caucasus, if they're no longer being exported, what Venezuela exports is nothing compared to that, the oil and gas. So the United States would need years, many years, to increase production to very large numbers. And even then, it still won't compare to the Persian Gulf. Then there's the issue of the type of oil that Venezuela has. It's very, very heavy oil. And while I don't know much about oil, but it's different refineries use different types of oil. You cannot just replace this oil with that oil. So, for example, Iran has light crude, but most of Iran's oil and crude is heavy crude. The light crude that goes to refineries wherever in Iran or abroad, that those refineries cannot use heavy crude. That light crude cannot be replaced with heavy crude. So Venezuelan oil cannot be used in refineries that use Iranian oil. Their Venezuelan oil cannot be used in refineries that use Saudi oil or Iraqi oil. And so I don't really understand how that argument would work. I don't see Venezuelan oil being able to um, help deal with an energy crisis from West Asia. I just don't see that happening.
I literally feel the same way, Marandi, because Venezuela has been under tremendous sanctions for such a long time. The infrastructure is not ready to produce that much of oil to be injected in the global market. But when it comes to the way that Donald Trump is trying, somehow, I don't know if you heard that he said that, look at what we've done in the case of Venezuela. We went there and we, kidnapped the president of Venezuela. That's a total victory on our part. But look at what Russia is doing after 4 years. They're doing nothing in the case of Ukraine. These are two different mindsets. the Russian mindset, how they see the conflict in Ukraine, and the way that Donald Trump sees Venezuela. How do you see this
Well, let me
difference?
explain
This sort
something
of
as because I cannot see you, so I think I'll have to wait till you come back. Just to respond to what you were saying, sorry for because I lost you for a moment. I wanted to add something too. One is also we have to take into account that the United States has a huge armada off the coast of Venezuela. And as they are in the process of negotiating, and who knows how long that will take and what the outcome will be, they can't move that armada and take it to West Asia to help the Israelis launch another attack on Iran. Why? Because then the stranglehold over Venezuela would fall apart. So uh, if the Americans remove the armada and move towards Iran or move towards Israel, the Israeli regime, then they won't be able to have the sort of they won't be able to continue the sort of pressure that they have on with the pressure that they have put on Venezuela as we speak right now. So that's another issue. The only thing that would help the United States in all this is that Trump can say this is a big win, and then people within the political establishment in the United States would say it's all very easy. We can do the same thing with Iran, which is, of course, an insane conclusion to make because Iran is very different from Venezuela, and Iran is infinitely more powerful, as we saw during the 12-day war. But and Venezuela does not have a tradition of fighting, and they don't have decent offensive and defensive capabilities. Venezuela's capabilities, we discussed this before, is in the potential for insurgency. They are far better equipped, let's say, than the Iraqis, because Iraq it was the south and central part of Iraq is flat, and much of it is desert. But Venezuela is mountainous and it's full of forests and in some places jungles. And so an insurgency would have a very good advantage there. So even if the United States puts boots on the ground and its investors come, if there's an insurgency, they can prevent investors from uh, doing anything at all, or at least they can slow down the process. So, uh, and the war in Ukraine is infinitely different from what you were alluding to, is infinitely different from Venezuela, because the Russians, they can, first of all, this is not a war. They came in and murdered 80 people and carried out a massacre among President Maduro's guards, and then extracted him and kidnapped him. But there hasn't been a war. As I said, the state is very much in place. Everything is intact. A few air defense installations have been hit, but they were never really seriously a serious threat to the United States compared to the armada that the United States had uh, put in place. That's they would not be capable of fighting back in that sense. And even in Venezuelan air defenses are much weaker than Iran's, and Iran's air defenses were not what took it to victory. It was Iran's offensive capabilities, its missile capabilities in particular, that left the United States and the Israeli regime in trouble, and they sought a ceasefire. So, but in Ukraine, the Russians, they can move forward much faster. Should they? They have a huge advantage in artillery. They have a huge advantage in air power. They have a huge advantage in their drone capabilities. So they can wear down the Ukrainians, and time is on their side. So the Russian casualties are much lower than Ukrainian casualties, and the Russians have a much larger army, so they can press forward. They can destroy uh, the defense capabilities, and then they slowly advance forward. That is a very different type of warfare. That is warfare, actually, that the Russians are doing. So they want to win. They want to win the war, but they do not want heavy casualties. The Americans are not even fighting a war in Venezuela yet. Whenever the Americans move in to take over and have boots on the ground, then we can start loosely, in a very loose way, compare Venezuela to Ukraine. But even then, it would be a very different type of occupation. Remember, what defeated the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq was not the number of casualties. The number of casualties that the United States sustained in Vietnam was much greater than Iraq and Afghanistan combined. But the cost of the US military occupation, because of the new technologies and the equipment, is much greater in war. And the wars today are much more costly.